Welcome to the 2022 Day of Translation. I'm so excited and so pleased you're here. Thank you. I'm Michael Holtman, the director of the Center for the Art of Translation and publisher of Two Lines Press. And on behalf of myself and my colleagues, it's a joy to be with you in person, and it is a privilege to host such illustrious guests as you. Just look at you, you're radiant. If you aren't already familiar with the Center for the Art of Translation, we champion literary translation and honor the work of translators. We're dedicated to finding dazzling new, overlooked, and underrepresented voices brought into English by the best translators, and to celebrating the art of translation. Our publications, events, and educational programming enrich the library of vital literary works, nurture and promote the work of translators, build audiences for literature and translation, and honor the incredible linguistic and cultural diversity of our schools and our world. We are in this incredible space, this beautiful museum in Washington, D.C. It's an honor to be presenting the Day of Translation at the Phillips Collection, America's first modern art museum. And this is the first time we're presenting the Day of Translation in this space. In addition to its stunning collection, I'm moved that this museum was conceived as a memorial, a beneficent force in the community. Duncan Phillips lost both his father and his brother within a year. He wrote, "Sorrow all but overwhelmed me. Then I turned to my love of painting for the will to live." So as a sort of background or counterpoint to today's conversations is a sense of ongoing struggle and heartache that I think many of us can relate to, especially as the pandemic recedes. This museum reflects Duncan Phillips' pioneering idea of creating a museum in the nation's capital where one could encounter the art of the past and the present on equal terms. It was a radical idea at the time. His philosophy of taking risks allowed for the Phillips to be the first to collect and exhibit artists who were not well known at the time, such as Milton Avery, Pierre Bernard, Georges Braque, Jacob Lawrence, Grandma Moses, George O'Keeffe, and Rufino Tamayo, among others. My hope is for a philosophy of taking risks to animate our time together today. Poetry Inside Out. I want to talk a little bit about one of the center's programs quick. This year is momentous because I'm very proud to share we've launched a new Poetry Inside Out teaching fellowship. Poetry Inside Out is a dynamic educational program that uses the translation of poetry in classrooms to unlock deep and insightful conversations about language, heritage, identity, and expression. Each teaching fellow receives a $5,000 stipend and immersive community-centered support throughout the year. The inaugural cohort of 2022 Poetry Inside Out teaching fellows are here with us today. Yes, Brandon, you can stand or not stand. Well, I'll just gesture to you. Brandon Barr, Albert Burford, Erica Darkin, Akila Leach, and Lisa Yuk Quinn Yao. Congratulations. I want to offer special thanks to the program's director, Mark Hauber, who is also here, as well as Arzu Mystery and Todd Elkin and Harvard's Project Zero. They have helped transform this innovative program into a catalyst for centering poetry's work in the world. These fellowships have been made possible in part by the very generous and enthusiastic support of Anne Germanicos and the Germanicos Foundation. September 30th is recognized as International Translation Day. As some of you know, September 30th is the feast day for Saint Jerome, the Bible translator who is considered the patron saint of translation. One of my favorite depictions of Jerome is by the Italian painter Niccolo Antonio Colantonio, Saint Jerome in his study, from around 1445, which depicts Jerome nonchalantly removing a thorn from a lion's paw. My friends, we are not here to lick our wounds. As my colleagues and I were putting together this year's Day of Translation, I kept coming back to the essays in the phenomenal book, Violent Phenomena, edited by Kavita Banhot and Jeremy Tiang. The book is a call to arms. Literature isn't a tourist guidebook, as the Indonesian translator Tiffany Tsao puts it. We have inherited a colonial legacy. What do we do with it? How do we disrupt ongoing layers of power and dominance, as the editors so eloquently put it? This is to say, today we celebrate the art of translation while also challenging it. I often think of the words of the poet and translator Don Che. In her acceptance speech for the National Book Award in Poetry for DMZ Colony, she said, "It is more important than ever that we engage in the non-predatory, idle labor of poetry and translation and be on the side of the struggles of those sat upon here and abroad." I want you to leave today with a long list of books you want to read and a renewed conviction to make meaningful change. I have some thanks to offer. So before we begin our panels in earnest, I'd like to offer some thanks to the remarkable roster of participants and panelists joining us today. I am grateful to them for venturing to Washington, D.C. during an incredibly hectic season. Several from across the Atlantic, several between meetings and publications and festivals. Anton Her, all the way from South Korea. Thank you, panelists. Thank you to the Phillips Collection and their excellent staff. It's a joy to be in this beautiful space. I want to thank Olivia Sears, the center's founder and board president, who is here. I bow to you. I want to thank, I want to applaud Olivia too. I want to also thank Loyalty Bookstores. They'll be serving as our bookstore partner today. They'll have a selection of excellent work and translation available for purchase after today's first panel. And they'll be here throughout the day. I want to thank the Center for the Art of Translation's donors who've made today's event possible and free of charge. I also want to thank my colleagues, many of whom are here with us today, for their brilliance, ebullience, encouragement, and support. Today simply would not have happened without the genius event manager, Leslie Ann Woofter. She hates compliments. Thank you, Leslie Ann, for everything you've done to make today special. Welcome, everyone. Let's begin. Panelists, for our first panel, which is Le Mot Juste, Reading and Reviewing Literature and Translation. Please join me on the stage. It's kind of more theatrical this way. Julian Lucas, Lily Meyer, Rhian Sasseen, Corinne Segal. And me. I thought we would begin by talking a little bit about discovery, how we encounter literature and translation. And I thought it would be interesting to hear about one of your first encounters when you were young, either in high school or college or afterward, when you were reading a book that struck you, that you knew was a work in translation, maybe for the first time, and how that changed your perception of the work and of the culture beyond American writing in English. I don't know if anyone wants to start. I can start with Corinne.
Oh, all right. I think probably some of my earlier experiences with literature and translation involved me having some level of knowledge that there was a lot that I was missing in what I was reading. And I think this must have been happening starting in high school with probably The Stranger, L'étranger, by Camus, as so many American students read in high school especially. And I have this memory of reading it and just feeling the gaps in my own knowledge, even though I don't even know that I would have called it that at the time. It felt like there were so many silences in the text, so many things that I needed context for. And I think part of that might have had to do with the gap in my own French between French and English, and my perception that there was so much that wasn't being said in the text in that space between the two languages. And of course, in an effective translation, perhaps, I don't know, we all have our own experiences with translation and reading translated work. Maybe you feel like it's a more seamless experience, but for me, the experience of reading translation often involves that level of understanding that there's more to the story, perhaps, especially if it's not a language that I'm familiar with in its original form. So that's probably my first.
Yeah. No, I think perhaps many of us in the audience, that was one of the first books in translation we've read.
Mm-hmm.
Rhian?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I remember reading Anna Karenina in high school and kind of really falling in love with it. Like, I mean, being sort of swept up in just the idea of, the entire idea of it, and then realizing, oh, right, like this, it's different. It's not, like, obviously it had to be translated, but it's from a different era, it's from a different language. But I think also, I think that was probably the first moment that I really kind of realized in my own head that what I was reading, like the words were chosen by someone else.
Yeah. Lily?
I think for me, it's a story about cheating in high school. I shouldn't say this, I'm in my hometown, my teachers could be here. I had a really fabulous Spanish literature teacher in high school who gave us very challenging work, including Pedro Páramo, Juan Rulfo's novel.
Just a brilliant book.
Amazing book, very challenging to understand when you're 16 and you're reading in not your first language. So I found a copy of it in English despite having been told not to. And then I got it. And then, I realized I could not quite understand the book in Spanish, and being able to get it in English made me grateful to a translator, I think, for the first time. It made me think about translation for the first time as a result.
Yeah. I have to ask a follow-up question to Lily. Did that experience kind of lead you to translation as well? Do you think of that as a seed for Lily is translator and critic on our panel today?
I think that class and that teacher certainly led me to translation just by showing me how much wonderful and challenging work there was that I could start to access in Spanish. And then as I began to read in Spanish, I started wanting to recommend books that I was reading in Spanish to my Anglophone friends and family. And that was what made me translate, I think.
I like that. Thank you. Julian?
Yeah, well, like my three other panelists here, it was an experience with a classic. I should say that I don't remember when I first was aware of reading literature in translation, but it really struck me as a freshman in college. I was in a class reading the brothers Karamazov, and there was a section discussion of what we had read, and I was saying something about the Grand Inquisitor scene where there's a moment where Jesus kisses one of the characters. And I said, yes, at this moment that Christ kisses, I think, Seryozha on the forehead. And the instructor in the class said, oh, well, that was a very nice contribution, Julian, but he doesn't kiss him on the forehead, he kisses him on the lips, Oh, I just wanted to clarify that. And I picked up the book and I said, oh, well, no, he kisses him on the forehead, it's right here. And it turned out I had the old Constance Garnett translation from the late 19th century, and everybody, because I had gotten late to the bookstore to pick up the course books, and everyone else had the more modern Peviar and Volokhonsky. So it really hit me that, what era your translation is from and the kind of, even the values of the translator plays a big role. So I think that was a big early moment.
Yeah. It makes me think of, in college, a similar story with the Inferno. People having different copies of the Inferno have very different reading experiences. Readers. So, discovering books includes, the work of critics and translators. I think of critics and translators often being in the position of introducing an author or a book to, English readers. A translator may be an author's ally or champion, and a reader, a review may be a reader's first encounter with a book or an author. I guess my question is that something that you weigh or calibrate when you're, engaging with a book? Julian.
Sure. Yeah. I think definitely, and it, sometimes it can be very anxiety-inducing because, especially with translated literature, American readers might not have the cultural context immediately to understand every part of the book, and then you as a critic probably, or may not have it as well, and it's something that you have to kind of develop, and so that's definitely something I take into account. Like I think the first translated book, or the first essay on translated literature I wrote was on this Rwandan writer Scholastic Mukasanga,
Yeah, right.
and the review ended up taking me like 6 months just because I was so, I knew nothing about the history of Rwanda, and her novels are so kind of bound up in that, and I felt a kind of responsibility to convey the cultural context there, and so it's part of the difficulty.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you who don't know, Scholastic Mukasanga, published by Archipelago Books. I think they actually have another one of her books coming out very soon.
Kibogo.
Oh yeah, which may be out as soon as like this week or next week or something. I don't know. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to that particular question about, this, I don't know if you'd call it a responsibility or just a knowledge that you might be introducing a work to a readership.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, for me, it also weighs heavily on my mind. I do feel very. It is a responsibility of like the critic to educate themselves when they're discussing a writer, and it's also very tied to kind of my feeling about like to read itself is it's discovery, and it's my love of reading has allowed me so many different experiences in my life. I come from a background in which I didn't grow up with a lot of money. Like my mother works in a supermarket, and so to read was, it let me see so many different worlds. And so I think about that too when I'm writing about a different writer. Like I want to do them right in a way, like I don't want to do a disservice to them, and especially because works in translation are so marginalized in the US and in kind of the English-speaking publishing world that I feel like very much that I'd like to, if I'm writing about someone, it's because I'm passionate about their work, and I want other people to be passionate about them too.
Thank you.
I can speak to the experience of working with translators on pieces and reviews as an editor, because this is something that I've spoken to a number of translators about when they are writing, maybe a more, perhaps a review, but then also sometimes perhaps an essay about their experience as a translator. And I find that the possibility that Julian was speaking about that's opened up in the fact that many American readers might lack the cultural context to fully understand a work. I find that opens up so many interesting possibilities in the space of an essay and what it can contain. And something that's come up with some of the translators that I've worked with has been their very inventive ideas around trying to convey sort of elements of a culture that they might be introducing to their readers for the first time through these kinds of sensory details perhaps, or even, conveying different parts of their experience with translation that might involve music, that might involve, pieces of their daily life living in another country that's not the US. So I suppose this is sort of a strange sideways answer to your question, but I find that that's something that a lot of translators feel very enthusiastically about conveying in these kinds of less straightforward ways through those kinds of everyday details that we all encounter when we're exposed to another culture.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, to build on what Corinne's saying, I always want to celebrate that effort when I'm reviewing a translation. I see that as maybe another responsibility, but also something very fun to try to write to try to introduce the work of the translator to an audience I'm also introducing a translation to. That's a big challenge as a critic, but I hope that I can meet it. I always try to.
It's very honorable and something that not all critics do. I was going to build on what Corinne was saying for a moment too. I think that especially with literature and translation, we see these essays that kind of provide a scaffolding around a work because of these cultural references or things that are happening in the language that you may not be as attentive to reading a work in translation. I think it's also something that publishers, like myself, you want to avoid lots of footnotes and all of the writing in the back of the book explaining the book. So thank you. This is also kind of along the lines of like discovering work, encountering work in the world. I'm curious, I'll start with Rhian. How do you find new work? How are you kind of looking out into this publishing world and venture to find new things or exciting things?
My answer is a little embarrassing because it involves Twitter. Like I'm on Twitter a lot, and I think it's really helpful when especially small presses are tweeting about or promoting like their upcoming works. I remember in particular, like I have a review in Bomb this month about the French writer Barbara Molinard's collection Panics that Emma Ramadan translated and the Feminist Press put out. And I found that when the Feminist Press was doing like a Twitter thread of like their spring 2022 titles, I was like, oh, she was a friend of Marguerite Dugas's, and like she destroyed all of her stuff, and that sounds right up my alley. And then I emailed the publicist. So keep tweeting.
Yeah, right? I think that's one of the things that, again, as, a part of my life is as a publisher, it's interesting to see these venues for discovery. I think many people still are finding things from word of mouth, from recommendations from friends and people, readers we trust. But I think there are these new avenues for finding work that maybe we wouldn't encounter otherwise. I've been thinking about how translators and reviewers have this some crossover. They don't always choose their projects. Sometimes they are assigned. And that's true for both a translator working on a literary work as well as a reviewer who, maybe pitched something or assigned something by an editor. Can one of you tell us about a book, in translation or not, that maybe surprised or challenged you that you may not have picked up if it weren't assigned?
So part of this involves an explanation of my job, but at Literary Hub, we're constantly going through books that are being published 2-3 months from now and trying to read everything. We don't always succeed at reading everything, but something that I picked up that I might not have otherwise would have been Stefan Tobler's amazing translation of Clarice Lispector's The Apprenticeship or The Book of Pleasures. And that was something that, it was on a list of books that I was supposed to familiarize myself with and read. And once I came to it, I was so glad that I did. And in fact, I found myself sort of putting other reading aside so that I could keep going through it because it's it's sort of a small warrior of a book. It's short and quite challenging, just in its density. And it consists of an extremely long philosophical conversation between two lovers. And that's all that I can really say in order to begin to do it justice. But I found that to be incredibly rewarding as a reading experience, and I probably would not have picked it up had it not been on that list for me that day, and I'm incredibly glad that I did.
That's a great example.
Mm-hmm.
What Corinne said sort of took me back to your earlier question, which is that, well, first, LitHub, I think, is a great way to be aware of new translations just because of the number of I've definitely found a lot of books and writers through that, but you're mentioning Clarice Lispector. I first read her stories translated by Katrina Dodson, which are an amazing translation and amazing stories. But sometimes I find new work through particular translators and what they're working on. So she's doing a translation of Macunaíma by Mario de
Which
Andrade.
just sounds
And
brilliant.
It seems amazing, but not being an expert on Brazilian literature, it's maybe not something I would have found otherwise.
I think that this is something that I think about too, and there's several translators in the audience that I feel this way about, where it doesn't matter where they're published, but I always want to read what they're doing. I kind of want to start naming names, but I'll resist. I feel like I want to take a spin back to this panel is le mot juste, to find the right word, but also the just word, the fair word, the accurate word. I think this is something that critics and translators share. What does it mean to do justice to a work of literature and translation? And I'll start with Corinne.
To do justice. I don't know if that is an always attainable goal in its sort of most perfect form. I think that it's the constant reaching after that goal that drives a lot of my work personally, and I think some of the other people that I've had the privilege of working with. I know that as an editor, it involves a lot of debate in the comments of Google Docs often, but I sometimes find those sideline conversations to be incredibly rewarding, just in what they reveal about the perspective and what is shared and what is not shared between a writer and an editor. So I'm not sure what it means to precisely do justice to a work in translation, but I do know that it's the process of debate that I find the most rewarding in looking to achieve that goal. I also think that there's an interesting thing that happens in the internal debates inside both the writer and editor's head, and especially a translator's head. I'm so fascinated in hearing from translators themselves about what goes through their minds when they read a work, and the sorts of many worlds of possibility that they see for a particular work. So when it comes to doing justice to a work, I'm very interested in personally asking my writers what was going on in your head when you were looking at that text. And I think the more precisely we can try to describe that is in itself a form of justice, doing justice to a work, describing the wrestling and the debate that happens around it.
I think that's how I often think of criticism in the world as kind of testing a work. Mm-hmm. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to either finding the right word or finding the just word or doing justice to a reading.
I mean, something I'm conscious of is that, as Rhian says, translation is very marginalized in American publishing, and I want to call attention to and to celebrate works in translation. And yet, as a critic, I am not doing justice to a book if I only celebrate it and not, in fact, critical in my approach. So I think quite carefully about writing only about works in translation that I can celebrate in a rigorous way. I think that's an important piece of doing justice to translated literature and to global literature that can get a little lost or can be intimidating.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think also, the writing process itself is very mysterious. And so, I write fiction as well. And so, it's when I'm writing criticism versus fiction, in some ways it's the same experience in which it's not right until something strange within you clicks. And you're in for me, it's a very bodily thing. I'm in the rhythm, I'm writing in longhand or typing on my computer, and I get into the rhythm of it, and it's only when the rhythm somehow is right, that's when I know it's done. But I can't explain that process. It's a very unconscious thing. But that's, when it sounds right and it lays right on the page, then I know that it's right.
I have a question for the three of you, actually. Lily, you were talking about being rigorous, and I wonder, when the three of you have reviewed or assigned translations, does it make a difference to you if you know the original language or not? is it ever anxiety provoking when you are reviewing something and you don't know the original, or the reverse? Do you look at the original when you know it?
For me, yes. I'm very anxious when I review a book that I have read in the original first. That's the most difficult for me, and it happens to me pretty frequently, actually, which is amazing that so much Latin American work is getting translated by amazing translators, some of whom are here. But it's hard for me sometimes when I know the original to not write about the original in a way that I think could lose a reader who hasn't read it, can't read it, won't read it. That's when I get the most in my head, I would say. And that's unlike needing to be more familiar with a work's background, say, I can't fix that by research.
Right.
I love the research process, but I get scared when the problem is in my own experience.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's like for you too.
Yeah, I feel like I'm actually less anxious if I don't know the language, because I was raised monolingual. I've been taking German the last few years out of like a private desire to read some like writers I like in their original, but I'm like anxious about my German abilities because I'm not a native speaker, and so it's easier if I just don't know the original language the book is in, because then I trust the translator. Like I'll talk to friends of mine if they speak the original language, and sometimes ask them like, do you know this writer? Do you know about like such and such? And like that is really illuminating. But at the end of the day, I actually feel kind of like, well, I'm stuck with this translator's words, and like I trust them, so that's what I'm going off of.
Yeah, I absolutely have a very similar answer to that. I am way more tortured when I have quite a bit of the vocabulary in my brain, and I just know it's like, the more you know you don't know, and all of that. So yes, if I'm reading, I was also raised monolingual, but if I'm reading French, a language that I learned to the point of fluency, then I am absolutely, there's no end to the questions I can ask about that text. Whereas then, if I just hit a wall, if I'm reading a work that's been translated from Japanese, a language in which I have no familiarity whatsoever, I trust the translator, and it's much easier inside my brain, which is it's a funny thing, but it is true.
What about for you, Julian?
I've kind of been going back and forth just listening to these three. It's difficult because, so my other language is also French, and that's my only other language. And sometimes when I've reviewed books translated from French, I have gone back and looked at the original. But even then, it's hard to, comparing what the translator has done to the original, you might say, I wouldn't have made that choice. But at the same time, you might say, or I've said to myself, well, I'm not a native speaker of French, so maybe I'm missing connotations of those words. I think, though, a book that kind of cured me of this anxiety was I reviewed Yoko Tawada's Scattered All Over the Earth. And it's, she writes in both German and Japanese, and has two great translators, Margaret Mitsutani and Susan Bernofsky. And I was driving myself crazy trying to figure out if the difference in the prose of the German books or the Japanese books, is this a difference between how Tawada's writing in these languages, or is this a difference in the style of the translators? And then on top of that, the book was actually about creating a new language. So, it became so complicated that I kind of just said, these are irresolvable questions, and that made it easier. So.
Yeah, that's such a great example too, that particular book and your review, because it's an excellent review, but that book it's about someone who's the only speaker of a language. So to wrestle with these in this particular context with that particular book is pretty interesting. I'll actually kind of turn this to you, Julian. I think you mentioned that particular review, but I think you've written these beautiful assessments of Yoko Tawada, Hervé Guibert, Percival Everett, Octavia Butler, among others. And I consider you a critic who is finely attuned to our cultural and historical moment. Do you, I'm not sure the best way to frame this question, but do you feel a responsibility to, have a work, to read a work against contemporary life? Or I guess I could frame the question, do you think writers have a responsibility to engage with contemporary life?
Oh, I feel like I don't like to give writers any responsibilities. I feel
fair.
I like the idea that they can just do whatever they want. But I mean, I feel like if a writer is engaging with questions, political questions, contemporary life questions, I do feel a responsibility to draw that out, and I think that can be even more difficult. And I don't know if I manage to do it always with literature and translation and international literature, because one thing I notice a lot with is not only is it marginalized, but even when books do cross over, they often cross over without the context that they came from. And so we have these rich discussions of American books and how they fit into a particular scene or the political climate, and then
or influences.
Exactly, and their influences, and sometimes we get less of that with literature and translation and international literature. So I do feel a responsibility to try to bring that back, because often that is what makes a book. Its kind of interface with the world is a big part of it. Though of course we all love sometimes something that's just completely escapist as well.
Absolutely. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to the reviewer or writing a review that, again, I'm not sure how to articulate the question in the best way, but do you feel like as a reviewer you have to speak to contemporary life?
I think that, it depends on your relationship to your audience. And every writer's relationship to their audience, to their readership, is so very different. I find that there are some writers that have a lot of fun playing with that, playing with the fact that they know what's in the headlines, they know what happened in the sort of daily context of their typical reader's life, insofar as there is a typical reader. I also find that a lot of writers are addressing questions in the text that are very old questions that maybe take some sort of specific form in contemporary life, but they tend to be old questions about power, about human relationships, about intimacy, and any number of other things. And so I think that a lot of the writers who I've worked with, and also myself in my own writing, I feel a little bit of freedom in being able to engage with questions that I know people have grappled with since forever. And I'm also thinking about a phrase that Julian used earlier, which was irresolvable questions, the irresolvable questions that come up in the reading of a translated work. And I think that some of the best writing and the writing that I hope to develop in myself is, engaging with irresolvable questions themselves, which are, again, very old questions. And you can always relate them to contemporary life if you want to. That's always there.
The question of politics is what really drew me to reading more literature and translation, because I found that works from various different countries were approaching politics and using politics itself to influence the form of the book in a way that it was very unsatisfying for me that Anglophone American literature wasn't necessarily doing that as much. There's an interview of the Croatian writer Dasha Drndic I think about a lot, in which she says, it's from 2017, and she says, maybe we're at a moment in time in which American politics is becoming interesting, so maybe American writers will start thinking about this. Their work will start getting interesting again too. And it's she had just been condemning Jonathan Franzen in the sentence prior, which yes, but it becomes I start paying attention to then how writers are interrogating language. I think a lot, for instance, the Austrian writer Elfriede Jelinek, I love her work, I'm obsessed with her work. I've written about it before for The Point, and the way that she's really famous for her use of puns, and in that she's able to interrogate power structures within the German language. There's a series of plays of hers, the Princess plays. Each play is after a princess. One is Jackie O, one is Sleeping Beauty. But there's one play in which I think it's the Snow White play, that the prince is saying something, he's like, well, we'll get the massacre, I mean the mascara. And like that, like in the English translation, like that's like so cool to see that works as well. But that just, that makes me look at the English language and like my frustrations with it or my love of it. And like, then how can I incorporate this in the English language as well?
I like that a lot. Lily, I don't mean to put you on the spot. You don't have to speak for all translators or critics or translator critics. But you are both a translator and a critic. And you're in this unique position. I'm curious to know, how has being a translator affected your criticism, and how has being a critic affected your translations?
Oh God. Like Rhian, I'm also a fiction writer.
Yeah.
And I cannot disentangle the three practices from each other. In most days, I do all three things. I often, when I'm writing criticism, am writing about a work in translation, pretty frequently referring back to the original, despite my efforts to persuade myself not to. I can no longer imagine doing any one of those things without the other two. I have no idea how true that is for other translator critics. But for me, I think all three practices are informed by, an obsession with research, an obsession with style, a desire to poke at those irresolvable questions that come up, I think, especially when you talk about work in translation or when you translate. The unknowability of what a work in translation could be like in somebody else's hands is a question that obsesses me and has begun to leak into my own fiction writing even. But I think that question is maybe at the core of the overlap between translation and criticism for me, and will remain so forever because it's always going to be unanswerable.
I'm here to ask some unanswerable questions. We're talking a little bit about it's the day of translation. We're talking about translation. Sometimes I think we've touched on this a little bit, but I kind of want to come back to it for a moment. Sometimes a book comes from a different literary tradition. One that doesn't map across what we know in the English, modernist, the Western canon. It's something from outside. How do you calibrate work from different traditions or from non-Western languages?
Calibrate in what sense?
Is it something you're taking into account? Like the book comes from a different tradition, doesn't have the same reference points, shouldn't, I just feel like, I'm trying to think of a good example. Sometimes I've read work that has skipped over some of the, postmodernist writers we know in English and is writing more in a very direct style that might even be reminiscent of, someone like Hemingway, but it's being written in, the 2000s. Are you, reading it differently or something that is from a language that maybe doesn't have, translators here joining us today can talk more eloquently than I can, but some that, these are languages that don't have the same kind of verb tenses. And, the act of translation from, Japanese is very different from the translation from Spanish or French. And, do you think about that as a reviewer?
I know that I definitely do. And I want to be respectful of the language and how it's very different, and the context is very different. And yeah, I feel like it's definitely on my mind.
And thinking about your great piece for Lit Hub about how not every country needs its own Sylvia Plath.
That's a
Great
great
piece.
example. Yeah.
But yeah, I think just being careful about what comparisons you do or don't make and checking to see if your comparisons are relevant can actually go quite a long way in grounding a book in its own tradition and being conscious of not putting a book in a tradition where it doesn't belong, doesn't come from a tradition that maybe it disrespects the book to try to jam it into.
And hopefully there's a way, though, to, relate a translated book to your own context and the context of your readers without saying, she's the Sylvia Plath of Ferguson.
Sure. Yeah, actually, my colleague who isn't here today, but C.J. Evans, who's our editor-in-chief, sometimes he'll describe how, Southern literature in America is kind of foreign to him and foreign to his experience. That sometimes when that's a reference point, like I need to do research in order to read those books well.
Yeah. And paying attention to the questions that come up as well. There's so many cultural contexts that are not my own within the US, outside the US, within my own community sometimes. And I think that, just being as finely attuned as possible to the questions that arise in the reading of a text is what I try to do personally. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Corinne. One of your efforts that I really admire is the way, you mentioned how you've, worked with translators to craft these really beautiful essays about translation or about their work or, introducing work to readers. But you've also done a lot to spotlight small presses in the United States who are doing really cool work. Can you talk a little bit about, building and nurturing a literary ecosystem?
Oh my gosh, that's such grandiose language. I love small press. I mean, some of them are small, some of them are not. I love independent presses.
Sure.
And I just have fallen in love with the work that I've encountered there. I have so much respect for what these teams that I've been working with can do. And I think that part of it is just coming at people with the full force of your enthusiasm and love for their books, which is what I'm often doing in people's email inboxes, or just being able to pay a lot of attention to what they do, which is something that I'm very privileged to be able to do at Literary Hub because, I also want to recognize that the outlets for that kind of work have gotten fewer and fewer over the years, and they're not very well supported, I think. But I think that's also a reason why I feel a responsibility to give as much real estate as I possibly can to independent presses that are also doing work that deserves much more attention and often working within subgenres and categories of literature like translated literature that don't receive, in my opinion, don't receive quite enough attention in the US, or at the very least could always receive more. So I think that that's about it. I just read a lot and I really love talking to people about what they do, asking them plenty of questions. In particular, Two Lines Press, I have to say. I'm
Thank you.
very, yes, loving your work. It's true.
Promise I didn't try to plug that. Before we open it up to some of our audience questions, this is a question that I think we've danced around a little bit, but maybe one of you or a couple of you could speak directly to it. As a reader and a publisher, I'm suspicious of canon formation, the Western canon, but I do consider the role of the critic, as I may have said earlier, a way of testing a work in order for it to endure. I'm wondering if any of you have kind of a philosophy about, criticism, about what you're trying to do in your media, what you are hoping to give to a reader.
Well, I don't know if I would dignify this with calling it a philosophy, but a priority I have is to try to say something about the worldview that comes out of reading a book, and to relate that to its formal properties, how something is written and what someone chooses to observe. What does that say about a way of seeing the world that they're proposing? I think this is easier to do when you're writing a review that's multiple books sometimes, because you can kind of try. So I try to say something about a writer's sensibility and what it might mean if we looked at the world the way that they did, and kind of conveyed to readers some of what I've gotten from trying to look at the world through their eyes.
I would say this is also a priority and not a philosophy, but I think quite a lot about that. And I think a lot about criticism as a way to display the subjectivity of reading, maybe even to undermine the high school and college idea that here are the symbols, and here are the themes, and here is the book. I frequently will, if I have an easy way or an available way to do so, I will try to explain an idiosyncrasy in my reading process in order to highlight how idiosyncratic reading is. And I'll do the same when I write about translation. I've written about how I am an East Coast Jew given to overlapping speech with my family and friends. And when I translate and when I read, I react in one way to very verbose prose, and I react in another slightly more challenged way to calm, laid-back prose with no feeling of interruption. That is very idiosyncratic, and yet it's fundamental to how I read. And I think highlighting things like that is an important thing that a critic can do for readers.
Absolutely.
Translation, the ultimate overlapping speech, too.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Steal that idea for something.
Yeah, no, I feel also just the goal is to illuminate something, be it a question, be it an author, be it, just to shed light on something.
I feel like my answer, is repetitive. But I think that really good criticism can involve a point of curiosity or identifying different points of curiosity, giving readers some kind of entry point into an experience that's not their own, and you can do that via any of the ways that you guys have already said. But I think focusing as finely as possible on those different points of entry is very important to me as a writer and as an editor.
Ask one more question before we open it to questions from our audience, which is, we don't get a group of critics together very often to talk about, your work or your practice or craft. Are there questions you might have for one another, about this project that you may share, even if it's in parallel?
I have a question, I guess, for Lily, but anyone can. But I mean, you've worked as a translator. To you, what makes for a substantial assessment of the translation of a book? Because since you've actually done this work, what do you think of as a reviewer really taking that seriously?
For me, it happens most often when a reviewer really starts to dig into prose style. I think that's something that some critics are frightened to do with translation because of the unknowability factor. But when I see a reviewer really starting to go, this sentence did this turn of phrase did that, this syntactical quirk has this effect, then I think, okay, you're not afraid of the translation, you're engaging. Or rather, I do this, I'm terrified of writing about the effect of translation, but when I start to write about things like syntax, I know I've made the fear voice in my head shut up a little. But that's a pretty crafty answer, so I don't know if you guys have less craft-focused ones.
I do not. I do have a question, unless you wanted to respond to Julian. I'm curious about how the three of you interact with different translated works based on even just what they look like on the page. I'm thinking about how different it is for me to read, for example, a translated book of poems in which you have English on one side, the other, sometimes the other language on the other side. Does that change your reading experience, or how does how is your physical experience of a book, how does that change your experience of it?
That's a really good question. But I think that it does change the experience in a way that, I'm thinking of, I spent a lot of time in the Balkans this summer. My partner is Bosnian. And one thing that was really interesting to me was that a lot of small presses in Sarajevo were also publishing their own English translations of their works. And so I would buy an English translation and he would buy a translation in the original, and looking at the comparison, I couldn't read the original, but the pages sometimes were structured a little differently just because of the way the languages lay differently on the page. And so that, from the moment you pick up a book, you're making some kind of judgment of it, but that's also in some ways sometimes inescapable, depending, if you can only read it in the original or only in a translation.
Yeah,
feel like this maybe actually relates to a question I wanted to ask you, Julian, which is that I love your writing about art as well as your writing about literature. And I'm curious, I guess this is a broad aesthetic question. I'm curious about whether you can combine thinking about art and thinking about literature, maybe even thinking about books as objects, or if those things feel like they come from different parts of your brain.
You know, I hope they can be combined. I try to do it. I'm not sure how effectively. I know our next panel is word and image, right?
Yeah.
That's a tough question. That's no, it's an excellent question. It's just I guess I think sometimes I'm drawn to artists who are very narrative and who are kind of proposing visions of how the world works in their art, I suppose. So there I see a connection. I don't think that's a satisfactory answer though, but so I'm going to answer a much easier question about the book object that we were discussing before, which is just that wide margins. You know. I hate it when there's no margin, even if it's not poetry, I feel.
Yeah. Fair enough.
But I have a question actually, which is, something big in translation is finding equivalents for particular registers of speech. And I think this is a very old debate, So I love, for example, Richard Burton's translation of The 1001 Nights. And he kind of famously or infamously uses Chaucerian English to represent, medieval Arabic and Persian and things like that. Some people find that super jarring, that sort of move, and people do it in contemporary fiction as well. You'll find American vernaculars in translated literature. I just wonder how the three of you feel about that technique. Like, can it be done well? Does it bother you?
I love it, frankly, because I feel like, there's like so many different ways to like use the English language. Like, why not use like every like crayon in your crayon box? It's just like one particular tool, and so like go crazy. Like, I love it.
I will say it's a risky tool. Maybe the rewards are very high, but if it is done wrong, it can go quite wrong.
Yes.
That said, like I'm writing right now about the new translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is in a pretty different register than the older translations. It is great. It is really cool to see that done. And it has made me more excited, maybe, about the register change tool than I have been in the past.
I think something that's exciting about that tool is that it can open a book to a readership that it wouldn't have otherwise. And I agree that it's risky. Sometimes it drives me a little nuts, to be completely honest. I sometimes encounter that and don't experience it as helping me understand the text really very much at all. But when it's done well, I think in its best form, it can draw in people that it might not have otherwise. Yeah.
It does seem to be a tool that works best for older works. For works where there are multiple translations that already exist in the marketplace. Yeah. I think sometimes my colleagues and I address this in our reading because if you have a debut author and someone is taking those risks, are you serving the work well? But that's just my opinion. I'd love to open it up to some questions from our audience. I think my colleagues have, there's a microphone here on the left, and there's one over here on the right. So if you could walk to the aisle, we'd love to hear some of your questions.
Hey, thank you for your talk. So my question is, I had two books come out almost at the same time, and one got reviewed really well, like New York Times and Publishers Weekly and whatever. The other one was completely ignored. And the one that was ignored kind of opens with like a head in the toilet, like it's not Sebald. So I was wondering, when you review a book, do you have different expectations as to what a translated book should kind of look and feel like, as opposed to a book that's not translated?
I will say that I am reviewing right now a great 2 lines book, Hugs and Cuddles, which is coming out soon, and which is quite full of quite graphic sex. My expectations are not different at all. Did I tell my editor how much sex was in this book I was pitching her? Maybe not. That will be a fun surprise for NPR. Not to spoil what I'm going to do with the review. So my expectations are not different, but I am conscious sometimes that if I want to be sure I can advocate for a book in translation, I'm a little tactical about how I pitch it. Maybe that was indiscreet.
Just like the book.
Oh, indiscreet is only the beginning for Hugs and Cuddles.
Orgy in a submarine. I will just. Any questions from our audience? We have answered all of the questions. Oh, there's a question in the back.
Just going back to, you were talking earlier about trying not to name somebody as the Sylvia Plath of X or Y. Isn't it a little worrying that we're still talking about a canon that is English that includes, classical literature, realism, modernism, postmodernism, when we're analyzing books that not only don't come from that, but they don't need to read those things. If you're writing in Telugu, if you're writing in whatever, why, as a critic, would you be using those as a measure? I mean, the reason this comes to mind now is that yesterday Blake Morrison decided to review Tomb of Sand, and his basic review is, I would have liked it better if it was written in English by Salman Rushdie. And I worry that we bring expectations to the broad translated literature that somehow says, yeah, but literature is what we have been doing in Europe for, 600 years. How do you fit in with us? Why should they? I think that's the question.
I agree.
Yeah.
What role academic writing plays in the research process for your reviewing? Partly because of Noel and the Noel books that Julian Press has been putting out. They're wonderful. And I know that some of those are dedicated actually to the translator of Rebecca Schwartz, the great Brazilian literary scholar. So I was asking if that plays a role when you're reading a book like that.
I definitely, when reviewing literature and translation, will consult scholarship, especially if I'm not familiar with that particular literary tradition. I try to do it more contextually. I try not to read readings or interpretations of the particular book that I'm writing about until maybe after I finished a draft. And then sometimes I'll look at those because you don't want to end up in a situation where you're like, was that my idea or is that something, and especially with the kind of exhaustiveness of a lot of academic scholarship, that can be a risk. But I think it's extraordinarily helpful, and honestly it's for, if you want to know the cultural context around a lot of translated literature, often that's the only place that you can easily find it as a critic is in the scholarship.
Yeah, I agree. I've definitely consulted scholarship. For instance, I think I wrote a piece about Elfriede Jelinek's work for The Point last spring, in which it was after Fitzcarraldo did a English version of her play Rheingold, but I was reading the first monograph in English from an academic about her work, in which she then also consults, and the academic in question then writes a lot about then German language academics' responses to Jelinek's work, and that was hugely helpful for me, just to read all of this and to again get context.
Hi, thank you very much for being here. It's very exciting for me because you published one of my manuscripts of a poem from Hungarian. And I wanted to just comment on the business of the size of the margins and the use of the original language with the translation opposing. And from my perspective, this was something that gave me a sense of elation, not because my name was in the book, necessarily, but because it gave other people who might know the language the opportunity to test my own skill at translating. And so it opened up a kind of excitement in me to see that that might happen. And that's another kind of review that I might not even learn anything about, you know. But it would give the reader an opportunity to dive more deeply into the text. Because from my view, a translation is a great act of empathy. And so that's one thing. And then the other is, I wanted to ask the question, how do you respect the culture of the person whose language you do not know? And what can we do about opening up the world a little bit more to those minor languages? My language is Hungarian. There are only 10 million speakers, you know. And how many people know about any of the literature there? I don't know, is that too much? I'll stop here.
I think we got it.
And one thing I can say is that I translate from Spanish, which is a very, very widely spoken language. And obviously, I don't know why I'm saying that, but a project that excites me a lot in the realm of translation into English from Spanish is a growing number of translators who are beginning to work with writers who self-translate from Latin American indigenous languages into Spanish to then get those works translated into English. I'm thinking, for example, of Ugly Duckling Press's trilingual edition of Miguel Angel Mesa's work. Miguel Angel writes in Guarani, self-translates into Spanish, and then has a translator who is fluent in Spanish, proficient in Guarani, and they've worked together to get his poetry into English. I think projects like that and innovations like that are really fabulous. I would love to see, read, write about more work like that. That's one example, but it's a very exciting example of, I think, what you may be asking or hoping for.
I also want to, you're reminding me as well of the work that so many people have done recently to translate from Ukrainian. In particular, Deep Vellum is a publisher I want to call out for just doing excellent work in that area, but there are many others. I think that it is helpful. This is such a very small part of an answer to your excellent question, but I think it's helpful to see the original language somewhere in a book, even if I understand it's not always possible with prose to put the two directly side by side. I can't even imagine how difficult that must be for a publisher, but it is, I think, important for the original language to appear somewhere in foreword, in afterword, some other category of a placement in a text. And part of the reason is that it provokes curiosity. I know that when I'm reading something that appears, when I can see a language, even if I don't understand it, I do start trying to read it out loud to myself, and I sound like a fool, of course, but that's part of learning a language, is that you're going to sound like a fool at least once. I'm also curious, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I would love any recommendations for Hungarian language writers that you would like to recommend, or books, or anything that comes to mind for us here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. If I could send that to you in writing.
Yes, you can.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
I think we'll take one last question. Well, we've got two questions. We have a couple of questions. We'll make some time for your questions. Start here.
Thank you all for this panel, this conversation. I think I have a lot of really interesting questions around some of the texts you mentioned, and I was thinking about some of the people mentioned, starting with Camus and Lispector and the Mario de Andrade and Ovid, and it's been really interesting, and also I find myself incredibly riled up. And I won't go into that, but because I'm thinking about, again, questions of what doesn't get written about, or on what terms things get written about or don't, and it has to do it has to do with what the receptivity is in a culture at a particular moment, for what kinds of languages, for what kinds of, Anton talked about two different texts, one being maybe, more well received than the other. And as someone I just edited a small feature on writing from less translated languages and thinking about kinds of writing, like, that don't culturally translate well. And I guess my question for you really all as critics is really if, kind of getting into some messiness, if there have been times where you really wanted to write about something and it didn't get approved. I've had that experience often because most things I'm interested in writing about don't have the currency. But I'm curious if you've pitched things that just didn't work. I really love Julian's piece on Ishmael Reed, and even though that's not translation, there is a translation about Ishmael Reed being covered in that way in the New Yorker. To me, it was impressive, and some things that get smuggled. I think part of the work of translation and also critical work is smuggling through some things that don't normally go to those, the traditional audience. And so I'm just wondering if you've had those kinds of experiences of just not being able to get something published, or getting something published but having to negotiate, or the things that get left out, or just things that kind of complicate your task as critics.
I can speak to that. From my experience working in newsrooms, before I was a literary hub, I worked in public media and had various roles there as a reporter, producer, and then eventually an editor. And I will say I had really excellent bosses that gave me quite a bit of freedom to explore what I was interested in. But I definitely did end up in some contentious conversations with people in the newsroom when I was covering, in particular, poetry and poets that were dealing with subject matter, sometimes identities that they simply did not understand. Being the case also that, as with most newsrooms in the US, unfortunately, the one that I worked for was primarily white, primarily straight, and any number of others, very mainstream. And I found that I very imperfectly, no doubt, negotiated with them eventually by using arguments that had to do with opportunity, basically putting it into language that stakeholders could understand, that had to do with audience development, with numbers. And I don't know if I would have done it the same way now. I do know that as a young reporter in a newsroom where my voice was one of the newest, I felt like it was the best opportunity for me to say something like, by not talking about these things, you're actually missing out on a significant audience that is otherwise dismissing our work, and it doesn't need to be that way. Of course, that's also still an argument that centers the quote-unquote mainstream viewpoint, right? That's still an argument that places those perspectives in writers at the margins of what they're doing. So again, I don't know if I would go about it that way now as a older person, but yeah, that was one thing that I did.
I thought that was a great question and great answer, and these are just, I think, struggles in all kinds of institutions and settings. As a critic, I've often encountered kind of the less resistance to international work or work from smaller languages, but I think there's often a second order effect of the tyranny of the peg. Everything has to have a kind of occasion for why do we need to, and I think writers who are working in some languages or from some countries, that's not as much of a thing. We're looking at Knausgaard because he's significant, just as a writer. But, what's the reason that right now we need to hear, Uyghur poets from Xinjiang, who have gotten a lot of visibility lately. But, one would hope that there doesn't need to be, some kind of global news story, horrible or otherwise, for there to be a reason to translate literature from an area. The reason should be
we're seeing
literature
with Ukrainian literature, for example.
Exactly.
And if Alex Zucker was here, he would say this is something that happened in the 90s too, with Croatian and Bosnian.
Well, and also I was going to say the problem with the tyranny of the peg is that it builds. While it can be a sort of useful tool in a writer arguing for certain coverage, it can also it often contributes to stereotype, both within a sort of workplace and also beyond in your readership. I mean, I know I was listening to an interview with the amazing Jennifer Croft talking about the fact that, and she mentioned the fact that, often there are certain perceptions that American audiences and editors, frankly, some editors have, of certain areas of the world where they want, translated literature or stories about Eastern Europeans or Central Europeans to be those of hardship, and they want ones from Latin America to be sexy, and it's just, these things are so much more complicated. So yes, I find that you can sometimes make that argument as a writer in a sneaky way, get the pitch in the door, and then do what you want past that. Sorry, don't tell my bosses.
No, sneaking a pitch in the door can be a huge tactic and a necessary tactic, and an awful tactic to have to use, frankly, but worth it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I feel like I've definitely pitched books or reviews of books that I know that an editor ignored it because it wasn't translated from the French or one of the big European languages. That's really frustrating, and it's also so much of it's tied to the power structures of publishing right now in the US. And I mean, my day job for the last 10 years has been working with social media and newsletters for different magazines, and just kind of seeing how so much, there's also such a huge divide between print and digital. People act like, if you're in digital, it's so bizarre. It's you can see even just depending, certain people went to different schools and all of this stuff. It's within the newsrooms themselves, how it's divided in these, just even putting a magazine together. And it becomes very frustrating to see then how these power structures are replicating themselves. And people will then act like it's very bizarre to read things in translation. People act like that sometimes. I remember just being at a lunch for something and a job of mine before the pandemic, and someone asked me from they were just so do you read mostly stuff in translation? This very accusative, that's so weird, why would you do that? I was I don't think I would say I read half and half probably, but also because I'm curious about the world. And so curiosity then becomes this bizarre thing.
I think, was there one last question in the back?
Go ahead.
Hi.
Sorry.
So,
Yeah.
My colleagues and I, we teach students that are both linguistically and culturally diverse. And I think one of our big aspirations is that there's a community obviously here, and we would like our students to one day participate in that community. So what I would hope for, or what I'd like a little more guidance on, is we live in the world of themes and symbols that one of you mentioned, and that's where a lot of our conversation in class goes. So being active critics, I just wanted a little more insight into your process of when you work through a piece and you're ready to write about it, what does that process look like when you approach being critical in writing?
I did not mean to disparage themes and symbols. I do, I do love and respect them. I'm sure we each have processes that look completely different. Mine involves a slightly alarming amount of note-taking, such that when I sit down to write, I have far more thoughts than could ever go into a finished piece. And much of the work of writing for me is organizing, reorganizing, weeding, linking the thoughts that I had as I read and reread the book, the scholarly material that I may have looked at, other books by the writer that I may have looked at. But this process, I think, for me comes from having studied history rather than literature in undergrad, and having learned to write through the historical method of I am going to gather every fact that anybody has for me and then reduce them into something coherent. It may not be the most efficient. I wouldn't recommend it to a student without warning about its inefficiency, but I do find it quite fun.
I also take way too many notes, more than I could possibly use. And I was writing a review recently, not of a translated book, but it's coming out soon. And I was just looking back at my notes, and it was just an insane journey, right? Looking back at your awareness of what you were paying attention to at the beginning of a book versus the middle versus the end. And I find that to be really generative, even just as like a piece of writing on its own, albeit a really chaotic one. So yeah, you just made me think about that as well.
I like thinking of it that way because so often it's like, I didn't use 90% of these notes. But I don't know, having similar processes a similar process to the two of you, I find that something that has helped me manage when I have so many notes and so many different thoughts is, if I'm looking for a place to start, sometimes I just try to, if it's a novel, I think of, is there a particular scene that I haven't been able to stop thinking about? And rather than start at the beginning, like Yoko Tawada is a writer from, I'll take the scene that has stuck in my memory most and start there. And sometimes that becomes a beginning, or sometimes it just starts to reveal the structure to me.
Mm-hmm.
I know there was one last question. I saw Danny with his hand up. We'll take that, and that will be our last question for this panel.
Thanks very much for this.
Yes? Oh, yes. Thanks very much for the panel. And I wanted to ask just quickly about the paratextual stuff, the introductions and notes and forwards and afterwards and things, and how much those are interesting to you as readers, but also useful to you as critics. And I ask this particularly because I'm a translator and I like to write, translator's notes at the end of my books. Partly because of ego, I suspect, but also because I found that it does actually change the sort of critical conversation that happens around the book. And thinking particularly about what I think it was really talking about, critics sometimes being slightly frightened to engage with things like craft and things like what goes into the making of a sentence. But I've noticed the books where I've attempted, well or otherwise, to write my own kind of 5-page, this is what I think is happening at the end. Doesn't always, the criticism doesn't always engage with that in itself, but it does really transform the extent to which the criticism a book gets actually is engaging with the translation. And I wonder whether that's something which is something you welcome, I suppose, as a way of sort of helping to create a frame for a conversation about a book that might be new to you, but particularly will be new to your readers.
I find them enormously helpful, and I love reading them. And if I haven't mentioned it, sometimes, like while writing in the reviews, sometimes it's just because they weren't included with the galley. But I always like to read them.
Also, sometimes that's the only easy source of biographical information about the writer, particularly if they're not hugely famous, will be in the forward. So I also find them very helpful.
Also, to return to that idiosyncrasy thing I was talking about earlier, sometimes a translator will write about an aspect of a book that would never have jumped out in my own reading. Mm-hmm. And whether I write about that aspect or not, just thinking about it, I think makes the reviewing experience richer, more fun, denser for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find the biographical notes in particular to be incredibly helpful. Yes, absolutely. It's so important for me to come to a book with a sense of who wrote it. Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. This was a really wonderful conversation.